Hello and welcome to another episode of The Mark Medley Show. And today's episode is titled, I Have to or I Had to Get My Hit Back. And I'm going to say that again. The title of today's episode is I Have to or I Had to Get My Hit Back. Now, as many of you who are listening to the Mark Medley Show, or if you happen to catch my radio show, The Reading Circle with Mark Medley, many of you hear me talk about what I do when I'm not doing this podcast or that radio show, which many of us call my day job. And my day job is being the principal of an elementary and middle school. I serve grades 2 through 8 and approximately 500 children. And in many instances, the children find themselves either in a fight or about to get into a fight. And then when I ask what's going on or what happened, the response I get most of the time, if they haven't already blamed it on the other person, either starting their response with he, she, or they, most of the time what I get is, I have to get my hit back. Or if they've already hit, they tell me, I had to get my hit back. And I look at them and I say, well, first off, no, you don't have to get your hit back. And if it's in past tense, I say, no, you did not have to get your hit back. And my next line of questioning, or my next question to them is, okay, you got your hit back, and I stock my sentence right there. Okay, you got your hit back, and they look at me like I have three heads, as if to say, Mr. Medley, what are you saying? And what I'm saying is, all right, you got your hit back, and as a result of getting that hit back, what did that do for you or the other person, or just what did it do in general? And it's rare, if ever, I get a child to answer that question. See, we grow up, or we've come up with this notion that if someone hits you, you have to hit them back. In fact, the bulk of my students, that's exactly the instructive or the directive, the instructions or the directive that their parents have given them. If someone hits you, you are to hit them back. As a matter of fact, some of the parents go as far to say is, if you don't hit them and I find out you didn't hit them, I'm going to hit you when you get home. See, this whole thing is breeding violence. It's a continued cycle of violence. If someone hits you, you have to hit them back. No, you don't have to hit a person back if someone hits you. As a matter of fact, it takes more courage not to strike back than it does to strike back, because striking back is easy. Once someone has hit you, the easiest thing you can do is to hit back. Very simple. But boy, it takes a whole lot of courage and strength to walk away, to let that go by, to say, you know what, I do want to beat the daylights out of you, or I want to hit you back, but I'm not going to. That takes a lot of courage. That takes a lot of moxie. That takes a lot of strength. But it can be done. One of the many books that I'm currently reading, one of the books is a new release on a book about John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. The title of the book is Kennedy and King, the President, the Pastor, and the Battle Over Civil Rights. It's an excellent read, and I highly recommend it. And I've read many books on JFK as well as MLK. I actually cannot get enough of reading about those two men, particularly Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But Martin Luther King Jr.'s past intertwined with John F. Kennedy's past back in the 60s. And ultimately, both of them lost their lives in an attempt to really save lives. Both of them lost their lives violently when both were proponents of nonviolence. So going back to what I hear on a daily basis from our students in terms of I have to get my hit back or I had to get my hit back. And what I was just saying, no, you don't have to get your hit back. And yet parents continuously direct their children to do so and have no problem with letting me as the principal of the school know, yes, that's what I told my child. When does the violence end? Because this is where I'm going with this. Violence causes more violence. The fact that you had to get that hit back or you have to get that hit back does nothing but continue the cycle of violence. Again, I have parents coming to my office hollering and yelling and expecting me to argue at them, and I just sit there and look at them and I won't argue back. Matter of fact, they get angry because I won't argue back. I had a parent the other day telling me, excuse the expression, quote unquote, this is pissing me off. And I shot back at them. Why? Because I won't argue it back with you? Oh, because you can't argue. Oh, I could argue, just that I chose not to. You see, hitting back is a choice. Arguing back is a choice. It doesn't have to be done. So when a child comes into my office telling me I have to get my hit back or I had to get my hit back, my next question is, okay, and then what? Because see, again, going back to Martin Luther King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of his quotes is, if we do eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, we will be a blind and toothless nation. He had the sense then to try to get this message across of nonviolence. And interestingly enough, our current president, President Donald J. Trump, one who loves to tweet, and I guess has been doing this for a little while now, because when I was researching prior to doing this episode, I went back and I found a tweet by our president. It was tweeted at 8:56 a.m. on November 11th, 2012. And the tweet read as follows: when someone attacks me, I always attack back, except 100 times more. This has nothing to do with a tirade, but rather a way of life. Let me read that again. That's going back to November 11th, 2012 at 8:56 a.m. Donald J. Trump tweeted, when someone attacks me, I always attack back, except 100 times more. This has nothing to do with a tirade, but rather a way of life. Contrast that with Martin Luther King's quote of, if we do eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, we will be a blind and toothless nation. So for my children that are always telling me they have to get that hit back, guess what? That child now hits them back again. And guess what? They have to hit back again. The hitting back has to continue. And as I also share with children, again, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, if two students did engage in a fight, it was a one-on-one. Matter of fact, they used to call that shooting the one. Whoever bested the other, that was it. It was over. Matter of fact, you probably became friends by that same afternoon or the next day. But in 2018, that's not how folks fight. This is what happens. Even if you win, you lose. Well, what do you mean by that, Mark? That means even if I am the winner, the person who lost, they go back and get 10, 15, 20 people to jump you, who was the winner. And now that you've been jumped by 15 or 20 people, guess what you do? You now go back and get 15 or 20 or 25 or 30 people to go back now and deal with the 15 or 20 who jumped you. And guess what then happens? That 15 or 20 and go back and get another 10 or 15. And now we have 45 or 50. And guess what then happens? The other side goes back and now enlists the support of another 25 or 30 people, and the cycle continues. And before you know it, you have someone dead over an insignificant comment that was made. Whenever you roll the tape back or peel the onion back, you say, well, what caused all of this? You would take it all the way back to some silly comment that he said, she said, that now caused one child to strike or an adult to strike, and now the other one had to get their hit back, and the cycle continued. Last year in June, I had the honor because I keep telling you all, I am a huge Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King fan. I just his ideology and his courage and conviction was so on point. He was going down that same road Jesus Christ was going down in terms of how to deal with violence. Because if you look at Christ, if you look at Gandhi, if you look at King, if you look at some others in terms of the nonviolence, they had that courage that I was speaking of earlier. They had that moxie. They had that ability that even though they were being beat and spat on and talked about and kicked and arrested, they had the ability not to get that hit back. So when I was talking to Isaac Newton Farris Jr., that's the nephew of Dr. King, that's Dr. King's sister's son, last year in June, and if you want to hear that interview, you can look it up on my YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube, put in Mark Medley or Mark A. Medley, and put in the reading circle, or put in Isaac Farris Jr. appears on the reading circle, and you can hear that interview. But in that time that we talked, Isaac was continuing the message of his uncle. Matter of fact, he told me during that interview that nonviolence still works. That we must become a nonviolent society. We must be able to stop the cycles of violence. And the only way to stop the cycle of violence is through nonviolence. So we shared that in an interview. He was espousing the same philosophy as his uncle, that nonviolence is still the way. I shared with you earlier in this episode that I'm reading the book Kennedy and King, The President, the Pastor, and the Battle over Civil Rights. And again, I'm just being reminded of what those folks went through at that time, where they describe how African Americans were trapped in a church with angry and mobster Caucasians outside with Molotov cocktails and hatchets and baseball bats and all kinds of weapons and hatred in their hearts. And yet they wouldn't strike back. In that book, it gets into the freedom rides of how the bus was pulled over and for the most part bombed and set afire. And how Dr. King and Dr. Abernathy were jailed, and how the Kennedys stepped in. And all this was in the name of nonviolence. And yet, we still have parents to this day telling their children, if someone hits you, hit them back. Not realizing that once that hit back has occurred, or as I said a couple of minutes ago, whoever wins the fight still could wind up the loser. Because whoever lost the fight now goes back and get an army full of folks. Because fights don't occur one-on-one these days. You have gangs involved. You have families involved. And ultimately, someone winds up getting killed. So Martin Luther King was right. If we continue to do an eye for an eye, get that hit back, and a tooth for a tooth, I had to get that hit back, we will be a blind and toothless nation. So as long as our children, and our adults for that matter, feel as if they got to get that hit back, the cycle of violence will not end. No, you don't have to get that hit back. No, you did not have to get that hit back. And even when you get that hit back, the question is, and something to think about. Give that some thought. You've been listening to Mark Medley. I do ask that you share this, retweet it, share it on all your social media sites. I also ask the favor of you subscribing on any one of the distribution channels that host the Mark Medley Show. You can hear me live on Saturday mornings from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. as I web stream around the world on gobrave.org. That's GOBRAVE.org. And I also broadcast at that same time while I'm web streaming around the world. Simultaneously, I broadcast on FM radio in northern New Jersey and New York, 88.7 FM. As always, I thank you and I appreciate you, and please do share. And remember, you don't have to get that hit back.